So recently, there were researchers from the University of Chicago, the University of Rochester, and Princeton, of Princeton, who did a study about why there are men that work less hours and play more video games. Right? And I'm not necessarily, and also, by the way, there's information in that specific study that showed that those men that play video games, and in fact, my generation on average plays video games more than they did almost 10 years ago. Here's a graph of that, but also females play video games at a higher rate than men, or are starting to have a higher rate than men. Like their increase from like the early 2000s has been 58%, whereas men have been 50%. And I'm not disputing the whole study in general. What I am disputing the conclusions. Why are men specifically playing video games at a higher rate? I'm drawing different conclusions than most people. Most people are like, okay, it doesn't. Most people aren't drawing the conclusions whatsoever. And I'm going to help you articulate, and I'm going to help articulate the point, because I think that some of the points and some of the reasons why men are doing what they're doing, specifically in their 20s, is pretty significant. So, for starters, the two recessions that happened in 2001 and 2008 are causes of why men specifically aren't working. And I have to be specific here. The studies show that, the researchers from the University of Chicago, Rochester, and Princeton, the study specifically showed that out of 100% of my generation of men, 15% are unemployed. They're unemployed. Oh, and by the way, this doesn't account for students. If you think this accounts for students, it does not. 15% of my generation is unemployed. 60% of that 15% live with their parents. So in total, 10% of my generation that aren't students, they live with their parents. And 10% live with their parents and are unemployed. 5% are unemployed and they don't live with their parents. So 1 out of 10 of my generation, 1 out of 10 of 20-year-olds that aren't students, live with their parents and are unemployed. Those are the statistics. That's what the study showed. Now, I have a former U.S. Treasury Department economist, who's saying that because of the 01-08 recessions, there hasn't been enough time to get back to where we used to be when it came to average work hours for 20-year-olds. Really, since the late 90s, it hasn't recovered whatsoever. And in fact, I have the quote here, and I will also have the graph where he's built up the statistical data, where he's showing you that, hey, the average work hours for men in their 20s hasn't recovered really at all since both the 01 recession and the 08 crisis. And here's the actual quote here. The hours themselves seem to be recovering at a healthy clip. If you look at the 01 recession, there's a huge dip. If you look at the 08 recession, there's a huge dip. But since 08, there has been a huge rise. Back to the quote. The issue for young men appears to be that hours hadn't fully recovered from the 2001 recession before the 2008 crisis hit. Put another way, young men seem to have had two really bad recessions in 2001 and 2008 without adequate time to recover in between. So the U.S. former Treasury Department economist, what he's saying is that there just hasn't been enough time. Give it time. The time will recover. And we haven't really seen anything like this. We don't really have a lot of generations with sample sizes that include two really big recessions, as well as a social entertainment platform like video games to kind of just go after for not working, as a substitute for working, or as a substitute to put in more hours in work. We haven't seen a sample size like that. So we don't even know what will be the outcome. It's easy to say that, these men aren't going to be able to do anything. These men aren't going to be able to function in society. We don't know about that. We don't know about the 10% that won't be able to function in society. We won't know that. So video games are a social media platform. Look at what the federal government just did. Here's an article of the federal government giving $224,000 to develop a clean water video game. Because they recognize, and by the way, the demographic for this video game is for 5th and 6th graders, but we know that video games reach a younger generation. That's why the federal government just put in $224,000 to help 5th and 6th graders learn more and learn why clean water is important. Whether you think clean water is important or not isn't the question. It's that the federal government thinks that it's a worthy investment to put $224,000 in the development process for a video game. If you don't believe that statistic, well, here's another one. The New York Post reported on this, and the New York Post actually wrote an article about how in 2015 there is studies shown in the city of New York, teenagers were playing video games more, and they were smoking tobacco less, they were drinking alcohol less, and they were having sex less. And the New York Post believed that there was a correlation between the teens playing video games more in New York on average and them having sex less, smoking tobacco less, and drinking alcohol less. So you have two really bad things, smoking tobacco and drinking alcohol, and one kind of good thing, that they do less as teenagers. And all three of those are kind of social activities. Like you talk to people, you go to parties to drink. You probably don't drink alone if you're a teenager. You probably don't smoke tobacco alone if you're a teenager. And you certainly don't have sex alone if you're a teenager. And you have all of these statistics that show that, hey, teenagers would rather play video games more than do the traditional social activities that our parents did, our grandparents did, and probably even our great-grandparents did. So we have a social entertainment platform that's making young men happy that we really don't know the outcome for. We don't know if these young men in 10 years will be successful or not because we don't have a sample size for it. All we really have to do is wait in the next 10 years and see what will really happen. Now, you have a lot of articles reporting on this, some of them I won't say giving false information, but putting the information and organizing the information in such a way that it can be very confusing or misleading. And one of those interesting articles happens to be from the New York Post. It happens to be by an author by the name of Kyle Smith, and I'll have his credentials up here. Notice how I have nothing up here because he has no credentials to talk about video games, but he has an opinion. He is a human being. He has an opinion. He has a right to share that opinion. I'm just saying his opinion isn't validated. Now, Kyle Smith is actually a writer for the New York Post and a film critic as well. And the interesting thing about Kyle Smith, according to the New York Films Critics Circle, is that he has been reviewing movies since 2005 and has never been nominated for a award ever. Now, Kyle Smith has two interesting points here that I would really like to enjoy to talk to you about today. One of those being a comparison that he makes with video gamers and drug addicts, specifically heroin addicts. And I don't have the actual quote here, but pretty much what he is saying is that men are happy because even though that they're staying with their parents, even though they're playing video games, even though they aren't necessarily working, and because they're happy doing that, it's self-destructive, and because it's self-destructive, according to Kyle Smith, who hasn't won anything, hasn't been nominated for any award according to the New York Films Critics Circle, he thinks that because all of this is self-destructive, according to him, they are similar to drug addicts. Apparently, specifically heroin addicts. Now, I've never done heroin, so I've had to look up what the effects of doing heroin are. I kind of briefly knew. I had my suspicions of what heroin did, but I wanted to be accurate. So according to the webmd.com, this is what happens when you do heroin. you have collapsed veins, you have infections of the heart lining, you have skin infections, including cellulitis, you have a high risk of getting HIV/AIDS, hepatitis B, hepatitis C, lung disease, including pneumonia and tuberculosis. Oh, and by the way, if you're a female, you also have miscarriages. Now, I've played video games for about 15 years, 15, 16 years. And in that 15, 16 year span of time, I don't think I've ever, and let me go back to my notes here. I don't think I've ever had collapsed veins, infections of the heart lining, and skin infections, including cellulitis, high risk of getting HIV/AIDS, hepatitis B, hepatitis C, lung disease, including pneumonia and tuberculosis, and miscarriages. But you can kind of X that out because I'm not a female. I don't think I've ever had anywhere close to those symptoms as a gamer. And yet he wants to make the comparison to heroin addicts. But hold on, if you think that that's ridiculous, to compare gamers to heroin addicts, there's more from Kyle Smith. Now, he, in the finality of his article, kind of the conclusion or resolution, he says, briefly, and I'm paraphrasing him here, he says that the time that gamers, or not gamers, but men are allocating to games could be used to build, let me see if I have the quote here, real human relationships. Now, there is a link in that phrase, real human relationships. And if you actually notice where the link leads to, it leads to the same article that I used to show that teens are playing video games more than smoking tobacco, drinking alcohol, and having sex. And we've already discussed that two of those, the tobacco and the alcohol, are self-destructive habits that are addictive, by the way. I haven't discussed that they're addictive, but they are addictive. So Kyle Smith's interpretation of real human relationships is apparently having sex, smoking tobacco, and drinking alcohol. And these are the people that question video games and say that video games are addictive and saying that video games are bad. But he would rather have teenagers, apparently, Kyle Smith would apparently rather have teenagers forming real human relationships by having sex, by drinking alcohol, and smoking tobacco. Well, let's not even take out, let's take out having sex, because there is positives to that. Let's take out having sex. Let's just focus on the tobacco and the alcohol here. He would rather have teenagers drinking and smoking tobacco, drinking alcohol, and smoking tobacco, rather than playing video games. And we've already discussed that teenagers, children, and adults play video games as a social entertainment platform. So he would rather have kids pretty much killing themselves over communicating and having real social interactions with one another. Hey, this is the world we live in today. But, I'm a little bit tired today. I'm sorry that that yesterday's video kind of ran a little bit late. I fucked up the whole editing process, and I also fucked up the upload process. That was on me. But I wanted to make sure I got this video. This video will definitely be late. It's like 6 o'clock right now. So I don't know necessarily when the video will be uploaded. Hopefully it will be uploaded by 7, 8 o'clock-ish. If it's not, I apologize. But I won't be uploading this weekend. I will be uploading again next week. Hopefully you will join me next week, where I will be discussing a couple of different things. One of those being how 2K is kind of screwing over NBA players when it comes to their ratings, and either straight up disrespecting some of these players or trying to get more money trying to make more money off of these players. Until then, have a fantastic day. I'll see you next time.